Salam sejahtera anda bersama saya Nala Huda dalam AWANI Global. Sudah lebih sebulan sejak dunia digemparkan dengan berita dari Afghanistan apabila Kabul jatuh ke tangan Taliban. Dan banyak yang sudah dibincangkan setakat ini. Adakah langkah Amerika Syarikat untuk mengundurkan tentera mereka dalam tempoh yang singkat satu langkah yang tepat? Manakala bagi negara-negara lain yang mengambil posisi untuk wait and see, tunggu dan lihat apa yang ditampilkan oleh Taliban. Adakah ini satu langkah yang wajar? Tetapi dalam segala perbincangan ini, di manakah suara rakyat Afghan itu sendiri? Apa yang mereka mahukan dan apa perjalanan mereka untuk mencapai hasrat yang mereka inginkan? Jadi, untuk AWANI Global Jam ini, saya bersama dengan Tamim Ansary, seorang penulis dari Afghanistan yang menjadi rakyat Amerika, dan beliau terkenal untuk beberapa bukunya Destiny Disrupted, A History of the World Through Islamic Eyes, West of Kabul dan juga East of New York. Dan sebelum ini beliau mendapat perhatian dunia apabila beliau menulis satu email selepas 11 September 2001 atau 9/11 yang mencuri perhatian dunia dan juga memberi amaran bahawa campur tangan Amerika Syarikat dalam Afghanistan akan mencetuskan peperangan. Dan Tamim sudah bersedia bersama saya ketika ini. Tamim, thank you so much for joining me. I want to start off with what people have labelled as Afghanistan being the graveyard of empires. Do you think this reflects the current situation there, and do you see history repeating itself? And if so, why?
Well, I do see history repeating itself, but the graveyard of empires term, there's something misleading about that, because actually it's only referring to the last, I don't know, 300 years at the most, and really only the past couple of hundred years that it's been the graveyard of empires. You know, people who evoke that phrase often say, oh, nobody can conquer Afghanistan. Actually, lots of people have conquered Afghanistan, and that's who the Afghans are. They're the various people who have passed through that territory and often conquered them. Now, you know, not to go too far back, but Alexander actually spent 2 years conquering Afghanistan. That's how long it took him. And then his people, his generals, ruled it for several centuries, the Bactrian empires. 2 years. America was there for 20 years. So we're talking about something different in this modern era. This graveyard of empires phrase refers to a time when Afghanistan has been on the line of scrimmage in a international story that's the story of Western imperialism coming into Asia and encountering other imperialists coming from the other side. So the thing that has been impossible for empires to do, and that empires have repeatedly tried to do in Afghanistan in these last couple of centuries, is rule it by proxy through some Afghan person that is set up by the foreign power to rule Afghanistan at their behest and in their name. And that's what's happened several times. Each time it happens, the story comes out the same way. So that's what happened in the last 20 years, but that's also what happened when the Soviets came 20 years before that, and then that's also what happened when the British were here in the 19th century.
In your opinion, what does the world always get wrong about Afghanistan? And do you think that this has improved in the past few years, or has it remained the same?
Well, you know, the thing about Afghanistan is that there is a culture and a society within that region, and it's working out some problems of its own within that region. It's kind of like there's a family quarrel going on in Afghanistan. But when the foreign powers come into Afghanistan, they don't really know about that family quarrel or care about it. For them, Afghanistan is a whole different issue. And the issue that Afghanistan is for the foreign powers is largely the strategic position it occupies just because of where it is. You know, it's just because it's right there at the cross section between the Indian world, the Persian world. It used to be the Turkish world in the north. Now it's like the Soviet world and the Turkish stands, Kazakhstan, all those, Turkmenistan and so on. And then over to the east further, there's China. So all of those are distinct civilizational powers, and Afghanistan is like the nexus between them all.
A family's quarrel. This is also what you said in an article recently. Afghanistan is one family at war with itself. What do you think then is the common link that can unite all of Afghanistan?
Well, who knows if there is a common link? You know, right now, uh, dramatic things have happened in Afghanistan, and it'll be a while before it sifts out and we see what the result of those dramatic events is. Um, I can only tell you that the article that you mentioned was probably in the Guardian, where I talked about the rural sort of countryside, that Afghanistan, and then there's like this other Afghanistan that's the urban Afghanistan. But I can tell you that, you know, growing up in Afghanistan, well, I was an urban Afghan, you know, and my family were Kabul people, and we were you know, educated. My father was a professor, and then he was in the government, and so on and so forth. But like so many urban people then, our roots went to some village. Most people who lived in Kabul, you know, they had relatives in the countryside someplace. They were completely sort of the urban extension of that rural world. So in that sense, we were all Afghans, you know, and we were all sort of Muslim Afghans in the Muslim way. So now I myself, for example, you know, my family, we come from a village maybe 10, 20 miles outside of Kabul. And then those people, they also came from further north. They came down from Bukhara, which is now in one of the stands. And my ancestor, great-great-grandfather, someplace back there, you know, several great-great-grandfathers ago. It goes back to the, let's say, the 18th century or so. So there was an ancestor that we all relate ourselves to, and his shrine is out there in the countryside, you know, maybe an hour's drive outside of Kabul. And he was a famous poet, you know, he was a mystic. And Afghan culture and Afghan Islam was all very sort of threaded together with mysticism, with poetry, with literature, and that was out there in the countryside just as much as it was in the city. So there was an Afghan culture that was working itself out and trying to do that within the nutcracker that is the imperial powers coming in from both sides, from the north, from the south, from the east, from the west.
Now, you describe Afghanistan as working out its own culture in its, you know, you can't eliminate its Islamic history. It has its own Islamic way. And I believe this is, or at least the way I see it, is a bit similar to how Malaysia demonstrates itself to the world. How we're not, you know, by law an Islamic country, but we are a majority Muslim population, and that is how we demonstrate ourselves to the world. Now, to make it out in this modern contemporary world, how do you see in the multitudes of culture that Afghanistan has and its Islamic history, how do you think this can be actualized in a stable, independent and modern government? Or perhaps this is not something that Afghans even want in the first place?
Well, I think, you know, there's a separate question when you're asking that question about the Islamic world, or if you're asking that question about Afghanistan, because Afghanistan has its own very particular problems. And I think that's probably true of most of the, probably all of the different Muslim countries. They're Muslims, but they also have some particular story of their own that's happening. So I think, however, that in the Islamic world over the past few centuries, there has been a sort of an interweaving of Islam with a whole political, historical thing that's been happening over the last few centuries, which has been the realization of many Muslim countries that they are, you know, they're occupied sort of, or they have been occupied by another culture which has a sort of an imperialist cast to it. So to rescue their own societies from this imperialist thing, that's kind of a story of its own. And then there's the separate question of what is Islam all about? And what does it mean to be a Muslim? You know, my father, who was, he was one of the first who was sent abroad to study at the University of Chicago and other universities in America. He came back, you know, so he's part of that educated elite of that time. And he would never in a million years have ever said, have ever stood for someone saying, "You're not a Muslim," you know. But he told me, he said, "My boy, to be a Muslim, what it means is you're a good neighbor, you're a good citizen, you don't lie, you don't cheat, you don't steal. Fundamentally, that's what it means to be a Muslim." So I like to say my father was a fundamentalist Muslim, that kind of fundamentalist. Then there's another kind of fundamentalist Muslim, which was, which in Afghanistan, I would say not fundamentalist, but conservative, traditional Muslim. And that's partly Islam, but it's partly very much interwoven with tribal culture, with, something that's grown and is native to that soil. And then there's another kind of Islam that's the political Islam, which wants to say that Islam is actually a set of legislative and government rules that can formulate a society in a particular way. And I think that the Taliban, who are now in charge of Afghanistan, they would embrace that idea of Islam, and so I think they feel it incumbent upon themselves. They feel like they have to, take what they consider to be the Sharia and then enforce that in the most literal possible way. So Islam is a civilization. It's got so many different intellectual currents running through it, and so many eras of philosophy and thought and theology in the history of Islam, that anybody who associates themselves with Islamic civilization, they have a broad field in which to ask themselves, what does it mean to be a Muslim? Who am I as a Muslim? And so it is absolutely true that there is a political cast to Islam in its history and going back to the beginning, because Prophet Muhammad, what he did was establish a community, and then he was the person who was in charge of running that community. So it wasn't like, there's other religions, I don't know, the Buddha, let's say, or Jesus Christ. Those people never said, okay, I'm going to govern a community and lead an army and so on. That was just a different sort of religious idea. So there is some political thing in Islam, but there's also a mystical thing in Islam. There's also there's all these different dimensions to Islam.
Now, obviously, there's a very multifaceted way of viewing Islam. You see it as, there being fundamentalist Islam, conservative and traditional and political Islam. Obviously, this is not how America looks at Islam, at least not right after 9/11. But from 9/11 until today, how far do you think America has come in opening up its eyes and, its lens to viewing Islam as not just through one specific point of view, but taking into account its dynamic history and its multifaceted features? How far has America come?
I think it hasn't really come that far, to tell you the truth, because the relationship of Americans to Islam in these past 20 years, before this 9/11 thing happened, I would say most people kind of weren't even aware that Islam existed in a way. My book, Destiny Disrupted, I go into how I was an editor of history textbooks, and that I was marveling that in the standard view of world history, Islam was one chapter out of 30, and it was basically seen as something that happened long time ago. So it was medieval Islam. And you looked at the map, and it's like, wait, the Islamic world is this enormous phenomenon, and it's right there. How is it that it's not a bigger part of history? Since then, however, when people could have then looked at Islam and said, okay, what is this? And there has been some of that. There's been a lot of interest in Islam, and a lot of people have learned a lot about it. But unfortunately, it's all happened under the uh, the interruption or complication of the so-called, if I might put it in quotes, the war on terror. So the war on terror now was a thing, is a thing, whatever, that's ambiguous to its very core, because terror is not an idea, it's not a state, it's not a nation. Terrorism is a tactic. So it's kind of like a war on ambushing or a war on, it's like, there's the problem with the war on terror has always been to try to identify who is it that we're fighting. So I think, it's been difficult for many people to separate the idea of this nameless kind of ambiguous enemy out there in the world from this civilization and religion and idea that's also a phenomenon in the world. The war on terror has complicated all of that.
In your opinion, how far do you think Taliban can change from what they've been 10 years ago?
Well, first of all, it is true that you said 10 years ago, but really you meant 20 years ago, because when the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, it was 1996 to 2001, I think was roughly those dates. So, those Taliban were basically the cadre of the Taliban were basically kids who had just come out of the refugee camps in Pakistan, but who were Afghan kids. And it's important to remember that those refugees were in those camps because there was a war going on in Afghanistan prosecuted by the Soviets. People have forgotten that now. You never hear about the Soviets and they're gone. So it's like, oh, who cares about them? But I sort of can't forget them. They were there and they did a really horrible thing. And one of the things that they did was they, in order to prevent, the insurgency from the countryside, they decided to bomb the countryside into sort of oblivion. They destroyed villages, they bombed them. But then the thing that they did that was really crucial is that they sprinkled landmines that looked like toys across the landscape so that people who were trying to escape from these bombings, the kids would pick up the toys, but they were small landmines, so it wouldn't kill the kids. It would just blow off a hand or a foot. A family with a crippled kid, it cripples the whole family. And this was like this cynical, war strategy. And then the kids that made it out of the country, they were in these refugee camps, and they grew up to be the Taliban. So when they came to Afghanistan, there's other factors there. There's Pakistan's interference and so on, Al-Qaeda and all that. But that core of Taliban, when they came to Afghanistan, and then they took over the capital city, they were teenagers or young men. They were like they were young. Now 20 years have passed, and those Taliban are 40-year-old, 50-year-old men. I think there's nobody who has gotten to that age who will look at themselves and say, I'm the same now as I was at 20. You just aren't. 20 years of experience changes who you are. But that's not all of who the Taliban are that are in Kabul now. There's other, factions and forces that are in that, I shouldn't say the government, but they're in Kabul, and they're trying to work out who is the government. So some of them are the father generation of those people. Some of them are people from the mountainsides, from the mountain valleys that are the border area between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that's a whole culture of its own. So that's a different people. So I think in these next months and maybe years, several years, those people will be working out who is actually the boss amongst all of those. They're not all the same people, and they are not an organization that has, a head and several deputies and then a bureaucracy under it. They just don't have that, and they're not a ideological party in the way that we understand that in the history of our times, because what they have is an idea about Islam that's doctrinaire and manual driven. It's an Islam you can look up in a book, presumably. So they don't have a program, they don't have a party, and that's all the things that they're going to have to work out now, because like it or not, they're a government, and a government, if it can't govern, then it's not a government anymore. So they have to work that out in the next few months, the next few years.
You also recently said that Afghans have a powerful progressive current of their own. It's Islamic, not secular, but it is progressive. What do you mean by this?
Well, the experience that Afghanistan had between the 1920s and 1980, when the Soviets invaded, was a steady progress, was a steady development of the country in a certain direction. And in the 1920s, there was a king who was had a crash program of westernization and modernization. And he was overthrown by a force of people from the rural countryside. And there was a 1-year period that was just exactly like the Taliban era. It was totally that thing. And then the original dynastic royal family came back. They overthrew the rural forces, and they took over again. But they took over initially as an extremely conservative Muslim government. And they had a ministry of vice and virtue, and that, people could not, they would get beaten if they were eating outdoors during Ramadan, and women were never seen on the streets without wearing a chaudhari, the sort of the body bag veil. But that government, there was one thing that they absolutely respected, and it was written in stone. The private world of a family, a clan, was its business. The royal family would not come through the doors and tell you what to do in your own home. The government that was this austere, conservative Muslim government was the government of the streets and the public life. And Afghan culture is such that the private life behind the closed doors, the life of the family, the life of the clan, the life within the tribe, that's a huge sphere of life in Afghanistan. And upon respecting that dynastic government was able to install itself, and it gained authority, and it governed the country. It governed in a diplomatic way. It's like the tribes inside the country, it had relationships with them the way governments have relationships with foreign powers. There were foreign powers, or there were sovereign powers within the country. And in that period of time, at first, they were completely this conservative government. And then they started building schools all over the country. And then they built a girls' school. And then they sent a few people abroad to get university education. And then by the time we got to the 60s, the whole thing about women and men, the women were in lots of girls' schools, there was co-education, the women were going to Kabul University. They wrote a constitution and decided that the royal family would no longer be allowed to hold cabinet positions. They created a parliament. There were elections. Women were elected to parliament the first time there were elections. This is the Afghanistan that was, nobody was telling Afghans to do this. Afghans were proceeding in this direction. And they were making it work. But then, not fast enough for some. So the royals were overthrown. The Communist Party came in. They brought the Soviets in to help them hold on to the power that they barely couldn't hold on to otherwise. And then 40 years of war started, much of it hell.
Now, lastly, Tamim, this progressive current that you speak of moving forward, how do we keep this spark alive?
Well, it really is up to Afghans. And I think there's a fellow who articulates the idea of progressive Islam and in the spirit of Afghan culture of the past and of fond memory. And that guy is Ahmed Masood, whose father was the legendary Ahmed Masood, the guerrilla leader. So he's set himself up as the leader of the National Resistance Party. So the thing is, if he would emerge as the voice of progressive Afghan Islam, there are so many people in the city who have grown up in this last 20 years who want this. That's who they are. That's who they're grown up to be. But a movement like that requires leadership to articulate the personification of that spirit. And maybe that's something this Masood fellow could do. It is, however, the other direction would be he'll gather some soldiers and come and attack Kabul, and there'll be a war. So I don't think that's a good. I myself it's like I'm conflicted. I don't want that. I know what happened when the Civil War was happening. It was so terrible. Afghanistan can't go through that again. And if it does, it'll set back the progress forever, because it'll discredit the whole idea of modernism. I think there's the spirit of it is there in urban Afghanistan, but what it needs is the spiritual leadership, the emotional articulation of the ideas.
The future of Afghanistan is up to the people of Afghan to decide. Thank you so much, Tamim. That's all the time that we have, unfortunately, but surely there's a lot more to be discussed. Itu saja masa yang kita ada dalam Awani Global jam ini bersama dengan Tamim Ansary. Kita jumpa lagi dalam Awani Global. Salam hormat.